The road out of Avanches was a killing ground, and the young pilot could see why from 4,000 feet. Below him, stretched along a French country road in the first week of August, 1944, was the spearhead of an American armored division. Tanks, half-tracks, fuel trucks, the whole long steel snake of it racing east into country nobody had scouted, with both flanks wide open to a German army that had not yet been beaten, only broken loose. In an older war, this was the moment a commander held his breath. This was where counterattacks came from. This was where a column got its head cut off. The pilot was flying a P-47 Thunderbolt, a big blunt-nosed fighter with an air-cooled radial engine that could soak up punishment no sleek liquid-cooled fighter could survive. He was not there to dogfight. He was there to be the flank. In the lead tank, far below, an Army Air Forces officer sat with a radio, watching the same road the pilot watched. And when that officer called a target, the response came in minutes, not hours. A stone farmhouse with an anti-tank gun behind it. A crossroads where German armor was forming up. A column of trucks trying to slip across the American line of advance in the dark of a tree line. The Thunderbolt rolled in, and the road erupted. This was the thing almost nobody outside that theater understood, then or now. The reason Patton's Third Army could run the way it ran, faster than any American army had ever moved, faster than the planners believed possible, was not only fuel and nerve and a general who refused to stop. It was the airplane overhead. It was an entire tactical air command flying nearly around the clock, screening a flank that stretched for hundreds of miles, so that George Patton could do the one thing he did better than any American commander of the war. He could ignore his flanks and drive. And the man who built that shield, who ran those squadrons, who sat in the tent right next to Patton's and made the whole air-ground machine work, was a quiet Texan named Otto Weyland. You have almost certainly never heard his name. That is not an accident, and it is not because he failed. He did not fail. He finished the war as one of the most respected air commanders America had. He would go on to wear 4 stars. This is not the story of a man the system destroyed. It is something stranger and, I think, more revealing. It is the story of how the mission he mastered, the unglamorous, decisive work of putting airplanes directly over the heads of soldiers, was quietly filed away as a sideshow. How the credit for winning the air war flowed almost entirely to the men who bombed cities, and almost none of it to the men who won the ground campaign from the air. And how, when the shooting stopped, the United States built its new Air Force around the bomber and let the thing Weyland had proven wither on the vine until a war in Korea forced it to remember. To understand how that happened, you have to start long before France. You have to start with a doctrine and a young officer who spent 20 years in the unfashionable corner of American air power. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to the man himself. Otto Paul Weyland was born in Riverside, California, just after the turn of the century, into a country that did not yet have an air force or airplanes worth speaking of. His family moved to Texas when he was young, and Texas is where he became the man he would be. He went to the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas, the school we know now as Texas A&M, and he studied mechanical engineering. That detail matters more than it looks. Weyland was not a romantic about flight. He was an engineer. He thought about airplanes the way a mechanic thinks about a tool, as something that exists to do a job, and he never lost that habit of mind. In a service that would soon fall in love with a beautiful theory, Weyland stayed stubbornly practical. He took his commission in 1923 and went into the Air Service, back when it was a small and slightly disreputable branch of the Army. Through the 1920s and 30s, he did the work that nobody wrote books about: observation squadrons, attack aviation, flight instruction at Kelly Field in Texas, command of an observation squadron in Hawaii. He went to the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, and to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, and he moved up slowly, the way everyone moved up slowly in the peacetime Army. First lieutenant, captain, major. There's a quiet irony in his time at the tactical school because Maxwell in those years was the temple of the bomber faith. It was where the doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing was preached as gospel, where a generation of officers learned that the bomber would always get through and that the way to win a war was to fly over the enemy's armies entirely and destroy the factories behind them. Weyland sat in those classrooms and absorbed all of it, and then went back out to the observation and attack squadrons, to the low and dirty end of the business, and kept doing the work the doctrine treated as an afterthought. By the late 1930s, he was commanding a pursuit group in the Panama Canal Zone and serving as chief of staff of the Air Force that guarded the canal, learning how to run fighters as an organization, rather than fly them as an individual. And then, Just before the war reached America, he was pulled back to Washington and made a deputy director of air support at the headquarters of the Army Air Forces. Sit with that title for a moment. Before he ever commanded a single squadron in combat, Otto Weyland's job in Washington was, literally, the problem of how air power supports ground forces. He was not handed the tactical air mission by accident in 1944. He had spent his whole professional life becoming the man who understood it better than almost anyone alive. Here's what I want you to hold on to about those 20 years. Weyland spent them in the part of aviation that the ambitious men were fleeing. In the 1930s, the future of the Army Air Corps, the glamour, the money, the promotions, was in the heavy bomber. It was in the idea that a fleet of 4 engine bombers could fly over an enemy country, destroy its factories and its will, and win a war more or less by themselves, without the bloody business of armies grinding each other down. That was where a young officer went if he wanted to matter. The men who would run the air war, Arnold, Spaatz, Eaker, the whole brotherhood that history remembers, came up through that world. Weyland did not. He stayed with the airplanes that flew low, that worked with the troops, that got dirty. And when the war came, that turned out to be exactly the expertise the Army desperately, catastrophically needed and did not have. To see why, you have to go to North Africa and to a mountain pass called Kasserine. In the winter of 1943, American forces met the German army in Tunisia and were badly beaten. There were many reasons: green troops, poor generalship, a veteran enemy. But one of the reasons was in the air, and it is the reason that matters for this story. American air support in that campaign was parceled out to ground commanders in small packets. A division commander effectively owned a slice of the air, and he used it to fly a defensive umbrella over his own troops, patrolling, waiting, reacting. It was comforting to the men on the ground. It was also close to useless. The aircraft were spread so thin that they achieved nothing, and while they patrolled emptily overhead, the German Air Force concentrated its own planes, struck where it chose, and dominated the battlefield. Part of the problem was written down in black and white. The manual that governed American air support going into Tunisia handed effective control of the aircraft to ground commanders, and it produced exactly the timid, scattered, useless umbrella that failed at Kasserine. The men who understood air power watched it happen and knew the doctrine itself was broken. The fix came from the British, and it is worth saying so plainly because Americans do not always like to admit where this lesson came from. At the Casablanca Conference in the winter of 1943, the Allies reorganized the whole air command in the Mediterranean. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder took overall command of the air. Under him, an air marshal named Arthur Conyngham took command of the Tactical Air Force. And Conyngham brought with him a hard-won gospel from the Western Desert, where the Royal Air Force had already learned to fight this way against Rommel. Coningham's principle was simple, and it was revolutionary. Centralized control, decentralized execution. One airman controls the whole force and throws its full weight at the decisive point. But the pilots on the spot are trusted to carry out the mission as they find it. An American officer named Lawrence Cuter served as Coningham's deputy and carried the lesson home. What the Americans learned in North Africa, they had learned in large part from the British, in blood. Out of that reckoning came one of the most important documents in the history of American air power. In July of 1943, the Army published a new field manual, 120, on the command and employment of air power. Historians have called it the Air Force's Declaration of Independence, and they are right, because its first principle was written in capital letters and it changed everything. Land power and air power, it said, are co-equal and interdependent forces. Neither is an auxiliary of the other. In plain English, the ground commander no longer owned the airplanes. Air power would be controlled centrally by airmen and thrown as a mass at the decisive point. And it laid down a strict order of priorities. First, win air superiority, beat the enemy's air force, and clear the sky. Second, isolate the battlefield, interdiction, cut the roads and rails and bridges so the enemy cannot move up men and supplies. And third, last of the three, close air support, the direct attack on enemy troops in contact with your own. Now, that doctrine was mostly right. Centralized control of air power was the correct lesson from North Africa, and it made the tactical air commands of 1944 possible. But look hard at that priority list, because the whole tragedy of this story is folded into it. Close air support, the thing the infantry and the tank crews wanted most. The airplane overhead, when you're pinned down and dying, was ranked third of 3. Officially, doctrinally, from the very beginning, the mission Weyland would master was defined as the lowest priority of tactical aviation. And tactical aviation itself was already the poor cousin of the strategic bombing campaign that had the Army Air Force's heart. This is the deep structure I want you to see. The subordination of close air support was not a personal betrayal by any one villain. It was baked into the doctrine, written down, taught in the schools. That is a harder and truer kind of story than a simple tale of a good man wronged by a bad one, and it is the kind of thing the historian David Spires documents so carefully in his study of Weyland's command, a book called Air Power for Patton's Army, which is the finest account of any of this that I have read. So that is the world Weyland rose into. Promoted to brigadier general in September of 1943, 1 star on each shoulder, he went to England in November, and in March of 1944, he took command of an organization that barely existed yet, the 19th Tactical Air Command. Its job, once the invasion came, would be to support one particular American army in the field. Nobody yet knew for certain which army that would be. When Weyland found out, it must have given him pause, because the army he drew was commanded by the most difficult, most brilliant, most impossible general in the United States Army. He drew George Patton. On paper, this should have been a disaster. Patton was flamboyant, profane, and famously contemptuous of anyone who told him what he could not do. Weyland was the opposite. Quiet, engineering-minded, understated, a man who made his points in a level voice and let the results argue for him. And yet the pairing became, in the judgment of the Air Force's own official historians, the most effective air-ground team the Allies produced in the entire war. I have thought a good deal about why, and I keep coming back to this. The two men were opposites in temperament, but identical in the thing that mattered. Both of them believed in speed. Both of them believed that the way to win was to keep moving faster than the enemy could think. And Weyland understood something about Patton that a lesser airman would have gotten wrong. He understood that his job was not to protect Patton. His job was to turn Patton loose. The respect between them was real, and it ran in both directions, and the record leaves us the words to prove it. Weyland, years later, called Patton the finest field commander he had ever known, and said that because of Patton's leadership, the relations between Third Army and his air command were marked by complete confidence in each other's abilities. Patton returned it in his own blunt way. According to the United States Air Force's own official biography of Weyland, Patton called him the best damn general in the Air Corps. Now, I want to flag that quotation honestly, the way this channel handles every quote. It comes to us through that official biography, rather than through a dated diary entry, so treat the exact wording with a little care. But the sentiment is beyond dispute, because Patton did something that proves it better than any quote. He told Weyland, to his face, that he would gladly have taken him as a corps commander. Think about what that means, coming from George Patton, who thought most airmen were prima donnas. He was offering to take an air general and hand him command of a ground corps. There is no higher compliment Patton could have paid a man. The partnership went operational on the 1st of August, 1944. On that day, Third Army became active in the field, and on that same day, the 19th Tactical Air Command began flying in its support. Weyland set up his command post immediately next to Patton's, not miles away at some rear headquarters, next door. He and his intelligence officers attended Patton's morning briefings. There was a joint operations center where his air staff and Patton's ground staff worked side by side, looking at the same maps, chasing the same enemy. When a decision had to be made about where the air effort would go, that decision was Weyland's to make, not Patton's, exactly as the new doctrine demanded, but it was made shoulder to shoulder with the ground commander, in real time, by men who trusted each other. Hugh Cole, in the United States Army's own official history of the Lorraine campaign, singles out that relationship, the personal trust between Weyland, Patton, and their staffs, as a decisive reason the whole machine worked. He started with 3 fighter groups. As the breakout gathered speed and more squadrons crossed the channel, that force would swell to as many as 9 groups, most of them flying the P-47 Thunderbolt. And the technique those groups perfected in the race across France was the thing that made the campaign possible. They called it armored column cover, and it is worth describing exactly, because it is the beating heart of this entire story. Here's how it worked. Over each of Patton's armored spearheads, Weyland kept a relay of Thunderbolts. A flight of 4 fighters orbited the lead tanks, flying roughly 1-hour shifts, and as one flight ran low on fuel, another was already on the way to take its place, so the cover never lifted during daylight. On the ground, in the lead vehicles, rode Army Air Forces pilots, serving as liaison officers, men who knew exactly what a fighter could and could not do, with radios that let them talk directly to the aircraft overhead. When the column ran into something it could not easily handle, a strong point, a gun, a knot of enemy armor, the officer in the tank, called the flight leader, described the target and often marked it with colored smoke from the artillery. Weyland's own account of it is plain and unforgettable. He put an Air Force officer in the leading tank of every one of those columns with a radio so he could talk to the aircraft, and the fighter bombers ranged ahead of the advance, finding the opposition before the tanks reached it. There was more to the system than the man in the tank. Weyland's people also put controllers in the air, in light spotter aircraft and in fighters flying above the columns, so that a trained airman with a radio could look down on the whole moving picture and steer the fighter bombers onto targets the tank crews could not even see yet. Requests flowed up from the ground, got sorted by priority at the Joint Operations Center where air and ground officers sat together, and came back down as airplanes on target, and the whole loop could close in the time it takes to tell it. This was not improvised cowboy flying. It was a disciplined system, built and rehearsed and refined, that made the speed possible. The magic was in the organization, and organization was exactly what Weyland, the engineer, was built to create. The response time was measured in minutes, in some cases 3 minutes from the call to the attack. Think about what that does to a battle. A ground commander no longer has to stop, deploy, bring up artillery, and fight a deliberate action every time he hits resistance. He calls the air. The air breaks the resistance, and the column keeps rolling. Weyland, ever the engineer, understood he was breaking an old rule of his own profession. There was a principle in tactical aviation that you did not waste air power on targets the artillery could hit. Weyland threw that principle out, and he said exactly why. Time, he said, was of the essence. The whole point was speed, and the airplane could be there now, while the guns were still miles behind on a clogged road. That is a small revolution in the art of war, and it is why I believe the armored column cover technique deserves to be remembered alongside any tactical innovation of the Second World War. It fused air and ground into a single weapon, and it is almost impossible to photograph. That last point is not a joke. It matters enormously to how this story was told afterward, and I will come back to it. Let me talk about the machines, because this audience knows aircraft cold, and the aircraft are the whole point. The workhorse of Weyland's command was the P-47 Thunderbolt, and it is worth understanding why that airplane, and not the more famous Mustang. The Thunderbolt was enormous, the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, built around a big air-cooled radial engine. That engine is the reason the pilots trusted it for this brutal, low-altitude work. A P-51 Mustang was a magnificent machine, but its liquid-cooled engine could be killed by a single rifle bullet through the coolant lines, and down low, over flak and small arms fire, that was a death sentence. The Thunderbolt's radial could lose whole cylinders and keep running long enough to get a man home. It carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, which made it a devastating strafer, and it could haul 500 and 1,000-pound bombs and a rack of rockets under its wings. In the groups that summer, you would have seen both the older Razorback Thunderbolts, with the framed canopy and the spine running down the back, and the newer bubble canopy version that began reaching the squadrons in England in the middle of 1944 and gave the pilot a clear view all around. A mix of the two is exactly right for the France campaign. The Mustangs that flew with the command, in groups like the 354th, tended to fly higher, guarding against the Luftwaffe, while the Thunderbolts went down into the dirt. The command was built from a shifting set of fighter groups, and the roster changed as the front moved and squadrons swapped between Weyland's command and Quesada's. Groups like the 362nd, the 405th, the 406th, and the 36th flew Thunderbolts in the fighter-bomber role. Reconnaissance was flown by the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group in stripped-down Mustangs and Lightnings, and P-61 Black Widow night fighters worked the dark. As for what they dropped and fired, it was bombs and 50 caliber above all, but also the 4.5-inch rockets slung in tubes under the wings, weapons the pilots found inaccurate and did not love, and increasingly napalm, the jellied gasoline firebomb that had seen its first combat use in the theater that same summer. If a render ever shows you a Thunderbolt over France in that period, look at the national insignia, a white star on a blue circle with a bar and a blue border, and look at the invasion stripes, which by late summer were being scrubbed off the upper surfaces of the wings to make the airplanes harder to spot on the ground. The details are the difference between history and decoration, and this audience knows it. Now, one thing I want to be careful about, because the men who watch this channel know their history and will hold me to it. Weyland's command was not the only tactical air command in Europe, and it was not, in some measurable way, superior to the others. Spires himself is at pains to say so. Pete Quesada's 9th Tactical Air Command supporting First Army did the pioneering work in Normandy, developed many of these techniques first, and earned laurels of its own. Because Weyland's command entered sustained combat a little later, it could learn from what Quesada's people had already worked out. Keep those two straight. Quesada and the 9th Tactical Air Command with First Army Weyland and the 19th Tactical Air Command with Third Army. They were sister organizations, not rivals, and the tactical air story of that summer belongs to both of them and to the British commands as well. What made Weyland's situation unique was the army he was tied to and the sheer geography of what that army attempted. When Patton broke loose in August, he did not advance on a neat line. He exploded across France, and that created a problem that had no precedent. Third Army's southern flank, along the Loire River, stretched for hundreds of miles, and there were not enough troops in the world to guard it on the ground. Patton did not try. He told his staff, again and again, that worrying about flanks was a waste of energy because the air would cover them. That was not bravado. It was a plan, and the plan had a name, and the name was the 19th Tactical Air Command. Weyland's fighters flew constant reconnaissance and constant patrol along that open flank. If a German force tried to move up from the south to cut into Patton's rear, the airplanes would find it, report it, and hit it long before it became a threat. And here Weyland folded in a weapon that most people do not associate with tactical aviation at all: Ultra, the secret Allied intelligence that came from breaking German codes. Weyland and his intelligence chief attended Patton's Ultra briefings, and they used that priceless information to point their reconnaissance and their fighters at exactly the places the Germans were trying to move. Photo reconnaissance, Mustangs, the F-6 and Photo Lightnings, the F-5 version of the P-38, ranged over the flank and the routes ahead. Across August and September, Weyland's command flew more than 2,000 reconnaissance sorties, a substantial share of its total effort, all in the service of seeing the battlefield before the enemy could act on it. An army that can see, tied to an air force that can strike in minutes, is an army that can afford to gamble. Patton gambled, and he won, and the reason he could is flying overhead in this story. The tempo in those first weeks is hard to believe when you see it written down. On a single day in early August, the command flew more than 700 sorties, and on the next day, nearly 800, and in the course of those 2 days, it lost 13 pilots, killed or missing, which is the sort of price that never makes it into the triumphant retellings. In the first 5 days alone, working over Brittany and the breakout, the fighters claimed hundreds of motor vehicles, tanks, horse-drawn wagons, locomotives, and railway cars, and they bombed and strafed troop concentrations and command posts across the whole front. Later in the month, in a series of sweeps against German airfields, Weyland's command and Quesada's together were credited with well over 100 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground in a single day. The Luftwaffe, which had ruled these same skies 4 years earlier, was being swept out of them. The first real test of the whole system came at a town called Morton in early August, when the Germans threw an armored counterattack westward, trying to cut off the breakout at its neck. If that attack had succeeded, Patton's race would have been strangled in the cradle. It did not succeed, and air power is a large part of the reason. When the weather cleared, rocket-firing Thunderbolts and British Typhoons fell on the German armor in the open. On one day in that battle, 7 rocket-armed Thunderbolts of a single group are recorded as firing something like 600 rockets into the Panzers. I want to be careful here, because the Mortain fighting fell mostly in First Army's sector, which means Quesada's 9th Tactical Air Command led that particular response, with Weyland's people and the British assisting. Give the credit where it belongs. But the lesson of Mortain belonged to everyone. A German armored thrust had been stopped in daylight, in the open, largely from the air. The thing tactical air power had been built to do, it had just done, in front of witnesses. The killing that flank protection made possible reached its terrible peak in August, in the pocket near a town called Falaise. As the German armies in Normandy were being encircled, they tried to escape eastward through a shrinking gap, and the roads inside that pocket filled with the retreating remains of an army. Allied tactical air fell on them. A flight of Weyland's Thunderbolts spotted a mass of German vehicles, hundreds of them, jammed on the roads west of Argentan, and worked them over for the better part of an hour. The pilots came back claiming hundreds of vehicles destroyed. The roads, when the ground troops reached them, were a landscape from a nightmare, choked with wrecked and burned out equipment and dead horses and dead men for miles. I want to be honest about those numbers, the way this channel always tries to be. The exact tally of what air power destroyed at Falaise is disputed to this day, and it always will be. Post-war investigators who walked those roads found that fighter pilots, in the heat and confusion, routinely overcounted, that the same burning truck got claimed by 3 different flights, and that many vehicles recorded as destroyed had actually been abandoned by crews who ran for their lives when the airplanes appeared. British rocket-firing Typhoons were over that same pocket, claiming heavily too. So when you hear a figure for tanks destroyed by air at Falaise, treat it as a wartime claim, not a confirmed count, because that is what it is. What is not in dispute is the effect. The German retreat became a rout, and air power turned an orderly withdrawal into a catastrophe. There is a smaller moment from that campaign that I love more than the great slaughter of Falaise, because it shows what tactical air could do without firing most of its guns. In September, along the Loire, a German force of somewhere between 19,000 and 20,000 men, the remnants of units retreating out of southwestern France under a general named Elster, found itself cut off, its road home to Germany blocked, its columns harried day after day by Allied aircraft and by the French resistance. Elster's men could not move in daylight without being attacked from the air. They could not fight their way through. And so their commander did the arithmetic, and he chose to surrender rather than watch his men die by the roadside for nothing. Now, there is a detail here I have to flag, because you will see it told wrong in half the places it appears. Some old newsreels and captions call this General Erich Elster. That is a mistake. His name was Botho Elster, and the German records are clear on it. The surrender was formally arranged in the middle of September, around the 16th and 17th, near Beaugency on the Loire, and it was received on the ground by Major General Robert Macon of the 83rd Infantry Division, whose troops were screening Patton's long flank, with Weyland present for the air command that had made the whole thing possible. Roughly 19 to 20,000 German soldiers laid down their arms, in large part because an air force had made it impossible for them to exist as a fighting force in the open. Not many were killed to achieve it. They were simply shown that resistance was pointless, from the air every hour of every day until the point sank in. That, to me, is tactical air power at its most humane and its most decisive, and it is exactly the kind of victory that leaves no dramatic photograph and gets forgotten. By late August, the great race was slowing, and here the story turns because the thing that stopped Patton was not the Germans and was not Weyland. It was gasoline. The Third Army had run so far so fast that it outran its own supply lines. The fuel simply could not be trucked forward fast enough across the ruined roads of France. Patton's tanks, which had been covering astonishing distances every day, ground to a halt for want of fuel, sometimes within reach of the German border. And in a bitter irony that sits right at the center of this channel's whole argument, part of the reason the supply system was overwhelmed was that the transport aircraft that might have flown fuel forward were being held for other purposes. Hundreds of C-47 transports, the tireless workhorses that could have hauled gasoline into forward strips, were reserved instead for a newly created airborne army and its planned operations, and more transport lift was swallowed up, keeping liberated Paris fed. So the fuel that could have kept Patton rolling toward Germany sat back in Normandy for want of a way to move it fast enough. In desperation, even heavy four-engine bombers were pressed into service as flying tankers, landing at captured airfields to disgorge drums of gasoline. It helped, and it was not nearly enough. Third Army, which days before had been outrunning the map, sat still and fumed for weeks, while the Germans used the pause to man the border defenses that would cost so many American lives that winter. It is one of the great what-ifs of the war, and it turned on transport airplanes assigned elsewhere. When it started moving again, the easy running was over. Ahead lay the grinding autumn battles in Lorraine around the old fortress city of Metz and the town of Nancy, in cold rain and mud that turned airfields to soup and grounded aircraft for days at a time. This was a different kind of war than the summer sprint, slower, bloodier, less spectacular, and Weyland's command kept flying through it. In October alone, the 19th Tactical Air Command flew nearly 4,800 sorties in support of Third Army. When the weather allowed, the fighter bombers went to work on the German rail network feeding the front, cutting lines, smashing locomotives, and rolling stock. On one day in late October, Thunderbolts of the 362nd Fighter Group put 1,000-pound bombs into a dam east of Nancy, breaching it to flood a stretch of ground ahead of a Third Army advance, the kind of precise, Army-sporting mission that only an Air Force working hand in glove with the ground commander even thinks to fly. In one 3-day stretch in the middle of November, when the skies briefly opened, the command flew more than 1,000 sorties and claimed hundreds of motor vehicles, dozens of armored vehicles, and more than 100 locomotives, and better than 1,000 railroad cars. Over roughly 6 weeks that fall, the command flew more than 5,000 fighter-bomber sorties, and it was grounded entirely by weather on a dozen of those days. That statistic tells you the real enemy of tactical air in that season. Not the Luftwaffe, which was fading, but the sky itself. Then, in December, the Germans did the thing nobody expected. They attacked. In the Ardennes, In miserable winter weather that they had chosen precisely because it would keep Allied aircraft on the ground, the German army threw its last great offensive of the war against a thin American line, and for a week the low cloud protected them exactly as they had planned. American air power, the thing that had punished every German daylight movement for months, was blind. And this is Patton's most famous hour, and Weyland's too, though almost nobody tells the air half of it. Patton wheeled Third Army 90 degrees in the dead of winter, an almost unimaginable feat of staff work and nerve, and drove north into the flank of the German penetration to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. Weyland's command turned with him, and when the weather broke, the airplanes did two things at once. Transports flew over the surrounded defenders of Bastogne and dropped them the ammunition, food, and medical supplies that kept them in the fight, while fighters escorted those transports through the flak and then rolled over to hammer the Germans ringing the town. It is a small picture of the whole argument of this video. The men inside Bastogne are remembered forever, as they should be. The airplanes that fed them and shielded them and broke the ring around them are a footnote. And then, a few days before Christmas, the sky cleared for good. When it did, the tactical air commands fell on the exposed German columns with a fury that had been building for a week of forced idleness. Over about 5 days at the end of December, Weyland's fighters tore into the road-bound enemy, claiming thousands of vehicles, hundreds of armored vehicles, locomotives, rail cars, and aircraft. The German offensive, already stalling for lack of fuel, was shattered in the open by the airplanes it had gambled the weather would keep away. The gamble had bought them 1 week. When the week ran out, so did they. By the spring of 1945, it was over. Weyland had become a major general by then, a second star on his shoulder, and his command had crossed the Rhine with Patton and helped run the last pursuit across a collapsing Germany. When you add up what the 19th Tactical Air Command did across its whole war, from the 1st of August, 1944 to the German surrender, the numbers are staggering. More than 74,000 combat sorties flown over roughly 281 days of operations. And the price? 582 aircraft lost to all causes, with the young men who flew many of them. Those lost numbers are worth pausing on, because they remind you that the shield over Patton's flank was not free. It was paid for, every day, by pilots who did not come home. And I want to say a word about how those men died, because it goes to the heart of why this work was never glamorous. The fighter pilots of the popular imagination die in a swirling duel high in the blue, one-on-one, the way the recruiting posters promise. Weyland's pilots mostly did not die that way. They died going down low, again and again, into the one place every airman is trained to fear, the range of the guns on the ground. The German army was thick with light anti-aircraft weapons, and a Thunderbolt pressing an attack on a column had to fly straight through a wall of that fire to put its bombs and its .50 caliber where they mattered. There was no evading it and no dueling it. You simply flew into it, did your work, and hoped. The men who did this had to master a particular kind of courage, the courage to do the same terrifying thing on the second pass that nearly killed them on the first, because the troops below needed it done. It is not a courage that photographs well or fits neatly into a legend. It is the courage of a man doing a hard job properly, over and over, until the job or the war is finished. I think that is the truest picture of Weyland's command. Thousands of young men doing dangerous, unglamorous, decisive work, and asking mainly that it not be forgotten. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have personal connections to this story. I want to do it justice. So let me get to the part that the title of this video promises, the part that I think is the real story, and the part that fits everything this channel is about. The war ended, and America began to build its permanent Air Force. In 1947, the Air Force finally became a separate service, independent of the Army, its own branch with its own budget and its own identity. That was a goal men like Billy Mitchell had died wanting, and its achievement is a genuine milestone. But an institution, when it is born, chooses a story about itself, and the story the new Air Force chose was the story of the strategic bomber. That choice was not irrational, and I want to be fair to it. Independence had been argued for decades, on the theory that air power could win wars on its own by striking an enemy's heartland, and the great bomber campaigns against Germany and Japan were the evidence the Air Force pointed to. The men who had led those campaigns became the leaders of the new service, and in the emerging Cold War, with the atomic bomb, the strategic bomber was suddenly the most important weapon on Earth, the thing that would deter the Soviet Union, the centerpiece of national defense. Strategic Air Command became the crown jewel of the Air Force, showered with money, prestige, and the best people, and under a hard-driving commander, it became the most powerful striking force in history. And here is the part that the Air Force's own official historians admit, which is why I can say it with confidence. In the Great Official History of the Army Air Forces in the Second World War, written by Wesley Craven and James Cate, the editors state plainly that the strategic bombing campaigns received the primary emphasis in their telling, not only because of a belief in what bombing had contributed to victory, but because of its importance in establishing the Air Force as a service independent of the Army. Read that again. The tilt toward the bomber, in the very writing of the history, was partly about justifying the new service's existence. The official record admits the thumb on the scale. So what happened to tactical air, to Weyland's kind of war? It was allowed to wither. When the Air Force stood up its major commands after the war, it created Strategic Air Command, Tactical Air Command, and a Command for Air Defense, all in the same reorganization. But they were not treated as equals, not remotely. Under the driving leadership of Curtis LeMay, the man who had firebombed Japan, Strategic Air Command became the centerpiece of American defense, the keeper of the atomic deterrent, and it drew the money, the best crews, and the institutional love. Then, in 1948, the Air Force went a step further and folded Tactical Air Command into a larger Continental Command, stripping it of most of its independence and its resources, and reducing it, for a couple of years, to little more than a planning headquarters with a name and almost nothing to command. The bomber generals, as one historian of the period puts it, won the favor of the civilian planners, and Strategic Air Command cast a long shadow over everything else the Air Force did. The airplanes, the squadrons, the money, the attention, all of it flowed to the strategic mission. Army officers watched this happen with real alarm because they understood what it meant. It meant that in the next war, if it was not a war of atomic bombers, the ground soldier might find the sky empty over his head, the way it had been empty over Kasserine. The hard-won lesson of 1944, the lesson Weyland had written across the map of France, was being quietly unlearned. And this is where I have to be careful and precise, because it is the whole point of this video, and because the sharpest people in our comment section will call me out if I'm sloppy. This was not a story of Otto Weyland being destroyed by the system. It was not. Weyland was too good and too respected to be pushed out. He kept rising. He commanded the 9th Air Force and Tactical Air Command in the post-war years. He wore more stars, not fewer. The thing that got sidelined was not the man. It was the mission. The strategic bombing establishment did not need to bury Weyland. It only needed to decide, quietly, in budget documents and doctrine manuals and the writing of official histories, that what Weyland did was secondary, a supporting act, a sideshow to the main event of strategic bombardment. And that is exactly what it did. If any of this sounds familiar, if you have ever watched the person who actually does the essential work, the one who keeps the operation running, get treated as support staff while the glory and the budget flow to the flashier department that photographs better, then you already understand the shape of this story. It is older than any of us. It just does not usually get written into the founding documents of an armed service. Now here is the turn, and it is the reason I did not want to tell you a simple tragedy. The thing about a lesson you have unlearned is that reality will teach it to you again, and reality is not gentle about it. In June of 1950, the Korean War began, and it was not the war the Air Force had built itself for. There was no enemy heartland to bomb into submission, no industrial web to unravel, no decisive strategic target that would end things from the air. It was a hard, close, grinding ground war on a peninsula, exactly the kind of war in which the ground soldier lives or dies by the airplane over his head. It was, in other words, Weyland's war, and Weyland was there. He went to the Far East in the first weeks of the conflict, and in 1951 he took command of the Far East Air Forces, the senior American airman in the theater, by then a lieutenant general. He ran the air campaign with the same clear-eyed practicality he had shown over France. Win air superiority first, then cut the enemy's supply lines, then support the troops. In the first desperate months of the war, close air support consumed something like 2/3 of the entire sortie capability of his air forces, because that was what the situation demanded, and Weyland gave the situation what it demanded rather than what the doctrine preferred. Korea also taught Weyland the limits of the interdiction he had ridden so hard in France, and to his credit he learned it. He mounted a sustained campaign to strangle the enemy's supply lines from the air, to cut the roads and rails feeding the front the way his fighters had cut them across France. It did not work the way it had in 1944, and the reason is a lesson every airman should carry. The Chinese and North Korean armies moved at night, needed astonishingly little to keep fighting, and repaired cut rail lines faster than the bombs could sever them. An enemy that consumes almost nothing is very hard to starve from the air. When the interdiction campaign bogged down, Weyland did something that went against his own grain. He called on the heavy bombers, the strategic force, the B-29s, to come down and fly tactical missions against battlefield targets, something he generally deplored because in that war, in that terrain, it worked. Results mattered to him more than theory. That flexibility, that refusal to be a prisoner of any doctrine, including his own, is the mark of the man. He would even lend a hand in building an air arm for a rebuilt Japan, the country his airplanes had helped defeat a decade before, and some have called him a father of that new Japanese air service. Korea vindicated everything Weyland had stood for. It proved in blood that a great air force which had forgotten how to support armies was a dangerous thing, and that the tactical mission was not a sideshow at all, but a matter of survival for the men on the ground. And the Air Force, to its credit, learned the lesson a second time. Tactical Air Command was rebuilt and restored to importance. In 1952, Weyland was promoted to full general, 4 stars, on the 5th of July, and after Korea, he came home to command the very Tactical Air Command that had been gutted a few years before. The man who had proven what tactical air power could do was, at the end of his career, put in charge of rebuilding it. He retired in 1959, a 4-star general having helped stand up a new air arm for a rebuilt Japan along the way, and he died in Texas 20 years later. So was Weyland forgotten? Here is my honest answer, and it is not a simple one. The man was honored. He got his stars, his commands, his place in the official record. If you go looking, he is there. But ask yourself this. You know the names of the bombermen. You know the men who firebombed Japan and who built Strategic Air Command. Their story is the story America tells about the air war, in books and films and the popular memory. Now ask how many people outside of serious students of the subject can tell you who flew Patton across France, who built the shield over that open Loire flank, who took the surrender of 20,000 men without a great battle using airplanes as an instrument of pressure rather than slaughter. Almost nobody. The man is in the record. The mission is missing from the memory, and that gap between the honored individual and the forgotten achievement is the truest form the erasure took. I said earlier that armored column cover was almost impossible to photograph, and that it mattered. This is why. A city burning under 1,000 bombers is an image. It is apocalyptic, unforgettable, and it makes the case for the men who ordered it every time you look at it. A single Thunderbolt rolling in on a hedgerow because a lieutenant in a tank asked it to, that saves a squad of infantry you will never meet, is not an image. It is 100,000 small mercies and small killings spread across a continent, and it does not fit on a magazine cover. The strategic bombing campaign came with its own propaganda built in. Weyland's kind of war did not. And in the long argument over who won the air war, and who therefore deserved the money and the glory and the independent service built in their honor, the side with the unforgettable pictures won, and the side with the ground troops who lived because of it lost. Thomas Alexander Hughes, in his fine biography of Pete Quesada, makes this same case about the whole world of tactical air power, that its triumph was real and its recognition was thin, and I think the pattern he traces for Quesada fits Weyland just as well. Rick Atkinson, in his history of the last year of the war in Europe, gives you the sweep of what these commands accomplished. And David Spires, in the book I keep coming back to, lays out the Weyland and Patton partnership in the detail it deserves, and reaches a verdict I find hard to argue with, that this was as effective an air-ground team as the war produced on the Allied side. The sources are there. The record is there. What is missing is the memory, and I would like, in my small way, to correct that. Because I believe the deepest lesson of Otto Weyland's career is not about airplanes at all. It is about what institutions choose to remember and choose to forget, and why. The Air Force did not sideline the tactical mission out of malice. It did it out of self-interest and self-image, because the bomber justified the independent service and the fighter bomber over a tank column did not. It took a war it was not prepared for, and the deaths that came with being unprepared, to force a correction. And the man at the center of it was not a martyr, but something more useful to think about, a supremely competent professional who was proven right, who was personally honored, and whose central achievement was quietly written down as second class anyway, because it did not serve the story the institution wanted to tell about itself. That is a pattern worth watching for, in armies and in air forces, and, if I am honest, in every large organization any of us has ever worked inside. If your father or grandfather flew with the 19th Tactical Air Command, or with Quesada's 9th, or worked the flight line keeping those Thunderbolts in the air for Patton's 3rd Army, I would truly like to hear about it. Those stories are the memory that the official record leaves out, and they matter. Drop them in the comments. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.